Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of those who've joined around the world. Great to have you here on the Crush the Quote webinar series. Today's session is titled How to Not Execute Your Revenue Strategy. And with us, we have the amazing Tim Ohai, who's the founder and CEO of Kupu Solutions based out of Hawaii. As a consultant, a coach, an author, and a speaker, and also a mentor to many, many others, Tim has spent years supporting and helping other leaders around the world figure out what is getting in the way of unleashing the potential of their businesses, their teams, and themselves, and potentially also in their own personal lives. And then doing something about it, something tangible, something practical. Tim's innovative approach of blending business best practices with core psychological truths is both inspiring and, I will also say, can be and has often been highly provocative, right? But that's what we are all about. That's what Crush the Quote is all about. We want to provoke action, provoke thinking, change the way people think. So Tim, very thrilled to have you here. Over to you to lead us through the talk on how to not execute your revenue strategy.
Thank you, Catherine. Brilliant. Well, aloha kakahiaka, as we say over here in Hawaii. That means good morning. I suppose I should begin with a little bit about why this topic. There was research put out by Harvard Business Review a few years back that said 95% of employees do not either understand or are even aware of the company strategy. And when you think about that shows up in so many ways. People are actually undoing the strategy, doing their own version of the strategy, not executing the strategy at all. It's a whole host of problems. And I've been experiencing this problem for literally years, and we've culminated into this presentation and these five patterns we're going to talk about today. The bottom line is this: if we don't execute, no matter how good the strategy is, there will be mass, not only confusion, but there will be mass fatigue. And our employees are people, and they will struggle to stay engaged and to stay committed. And everything that we're doing, no matter how great or noble it might be, will fail. And that's something that, frankly, deserves a lot of attention. So I've put this together, and the idea here is to very quickly put aside two things. One, we're going to put aside bad strategy. Does it exist? Yes. My experience has been most strategies are good enough. Are they perfect? Rarely. But most strategies are good enough. So it's usually not the strategy. The other problem is far more prevalent, but again, we're going to move it to the side, although we'll touch into it a little bit. And it's the quality of the leadership, because if you have bad leaders, it doesn't matter how great the strategy is, it won't execute. So if you have a bad strategy, if you have bad leadership, that's not going to fix your execution. But today, we're going to dive into 5 things that you can address, that it is possible to improve and to make your execution even stronger. And even if you don't do all 5, you can still do 1, 2, or even 3 of these and still get massive improvement in your execution. So without further ado, let's dive into this. First things first, what does the word strategy mean? Normally, if we were face-to-face, I'd let you all take a moment, write your own definition of strategy, but I'm going to run ahead of it so we can get to the Q&A at the end. And I'm going to throw this out. This is straight out of dictionary.com, very standard definition. Strategy is a careful plan. And almost every definition of strategy you're going to find is going to say strategy is a plan in order to achieve an outcome. And work from a guy named Henry Mintzberg upended that definition by saying strategy is a pattern in a string of decisions. And the key here is the concept of decision. So strategy is a decision-making discipline. And I would take that one step further and say the number one reason that strategies fail to execute is poor decision-making. Therefore, strategic execution is a decision-making discipline as well. So we, as leaders, are not responsible to put together a great plan and hand it to the organization and have them execute. We, as leaders, need to have a plan, but we need to hover around that, to work around that, and create an atmosphere where everybody in the revenue engine can execute and make great decisions while they're implementing a plan, making decisions, tweaking that plan, putting the plan aside, adding to the plan, reinforcing the plan, all those things that happen so that by the end of Q4, we've hit the strategic objective. And all the other things that we can be distracted by are almost all driven by poor decision-making. So I created a model that addresses the 5 most common areas that disrupt great decision-making instead of how to have a great plan. The sad part here is, unfortunately, most people don't even have an execution model in their head. When you talk about execution, if you go to Amazon and you start looking at strategic execution and books on there, you're going to get a lot of books around just strategy and strategic planning. It's like over 90%. And of the books that are left around execution are really still about planning. They say execution in the title. So really, the math I did last month was about 96% of what's out there on Amazon right now is about how to plan, and it's not how to build a true execution environment. So let's dive in, because everything looks great on paper until people get involved. And my premise is the number one reason we don't execute well is something that's going on here and something's going on here. First one, lack of clarity. Right? So I can't tell you how often I'm told that success is defined as a bunch of metrics, or even just get better, or here's the date. That's the date, we hit the date, or here's the number, hit the number. But when clarity is unhealthy, we not only create confusion, we inject misinformation, because in the absence of information, people create their own. And this problem shows up in many ways, but usually it's the idea of competing priorities, unclear goals, people not doing their jobs the way they're supposed to be doing their jobs. And what winds up happening from Q1 to Q2 is just chaotic and unorganized, and to a point, frankly, competitive. And you start seeing sales and marketing starting to fight with each other, or even groups within marketing. You might have, brand marketing against field marketing. And then you add in other groups like operations and finance, and they start putting in their own injection of prioritization. They start redefining what the goals are, and you start seeing massive, massive problems as a result. We'll come back to this one in a moment. The second big obstacle is a lack of empowerment. Let's say we make all the expectations really, really clear, but we don't empower people to meet them. And when this is happening, it's incredibly frustrating. When it's unhealthy, people are unable to make decisions that are aligned with the definition of success, but it leads everyone to inertia. So you've got a situation where you've made the expectations super clear. You've done a lot of really good work, but now sales hasn't been given what they need in order to execute the revenue strategy because marketing didn't create it. Or marketing created something worse and sales isn't using it. How often do we see playbooks and materials sitting unused, and sales then goes off and creates their own stuff and shares it with the customer, and it may or may not be even aligned? Don't know. Roll the dice. But how we empower has a direct impact on how proactive we are as a team. So when you go back to execution, you want people to be empowered to make great decisions so they can proactively navigate the obstacle and keep the strategy rolling forward. And when we empower people to achieve what we've made clear, we tap into their passions and ability, which leads into the third point, the lack of engagement. If we haven't made things clear and we haven't empowered people, trust me, people will start checking out. And that lack of engagement is quite frankly one of the hardest parts to navigate. And we're getting into really tough stuff, but think about your strategic plans. Do they embed these human dynamics in your execution? So it's not just all this effort to get to launch, it's actually keeping people engaged post-launch through the successive quarters. You're expecting metrics to come in, feedback to come in, so you can adjust and make corrections and reinforcements. If people aren't engaged, they are not going to be providing any of that information, and that apathy is going to take over, and it ruins your execution. So people won't believe in the strategy if they don't believe it's good for them to do. And we're seeing this a lot. Great example that's kind of all over the world is return to workplace. There are people all over who are fighting against that because they don't believe it's the right thing for them to do, even though leadership's saying, hey, we want you back in the office. There's got to be a way to maintain engagement without sacrificing your effectiveness as a team. And people need to feel they have a voice in how things are being done. If you do that, then you can go to the fourth point, the lack of accountability. And I've seen this happen over and over, where marketing will say one thing and sales will completely ignore them. Or senior sales will say something maybe in the US or in the UK or wherever the headquarters is, but with regional, it's just all over the place. It's literally like herding cats. And that lack of accountability, frankly, destroys your execution, because when decision-making becomes dysfunctional, it becomes incredibly wasteful. And people are literally sucking away the resources, the clarity, and the engagement, all the things you've built in, because nobody really wants to do what's best for the team. Everybody's in a self-serving mode, and literally execution becomes a dogfight between functions, between roles, and even individual employees. And it gets really tough when it starts getting more senior levels, and you've got folks who aren't accountable to each other because they have senior or executive in front of their VP title, or even chief. So how we use accountability must increase the potential of the business, not limit it. And I'm not talking about injecting consequence. I'm talking about injecting trust. So last one. And if you feel like these are getting harder to address as we go, they are, because the design is, let's start with the low-hanging fruit and work our way to the hardest stuff. And the last one is the toughest. It's the lack of culture. When we have a situation where the culture is unhealthy, the common ground that everyone needs to make great decisions either doesn't exist, or it's so small that the most senior leader gets to make all the decisions themselves. And they're just tapping into what everybody agrees with, and then they go do that. And that could be motivated by survival mode. It can also be motivated by ego. And culture is going to create an anchor that drags the execution down, and it will limit how far it can drift against that cultural anchor. We've all heard the phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I like to say it eats execution for lunch. It's really a situation where we want to make sure we're tapping into all of these dynamics, but we've got to do it in a way that actually makes progress, because you can't just go fix culture overnight and expect clarity to get better and all the other things. So I've created this wheel as a way to visualize these concepts. We start with clarity. Once we establish clarity, low-hanging fruit, then we make sure empowerment's locked in. If we do clarity and empowerment locked in, you'd be amazed at how well execution improves. I've seen it happen over and over and over again. And naturally, that starts fueling better engagement, but you still have to make sure you're doing it the right way. And then you can tackle accountability. And then you can tackle culture. But once you've completed that cycle, culture now becomes the fuel for improving clarity, empowerment, engagement, accountability, and around it goes. And this becomes a wheel of improvement that we probably aren't intentionally tapping into. So let's talk about 3 quick things before we go to Q&A. I said at the beginning, I'll come back to clarity. There's 3 things we can do. And I want to make sure you walk away with not just the sense of, oh, great, I can now see where we're breaking down in our execution and how these groups aren't aligning and all these things are failing. Let me quickly go after clarity so that you can do something right now and even share with somebody else on what you want done. So the first thing I want to do is make sure we're clear about the scope of what we're trying to do. And I have found consistently separating optimization versus transformation is critical to this. Optimization limits and reduces disruption, and transformation generates disruption. So if you have a revenue strategy, let's say we're introducing a better program for a pre-existing product or service that we have, and the program's going to just really bring it to life, and we're super excited. Is that going to change and disrupt everything, or is that optimizing how we sell? It's probably optimization. Opposite example would be we've acquired another company, or we're launching a brand new SKU. It's actually completely different than anything we've ever done. Now we're transforming, and now we're generating disruption. The problem is you have 2 very different leadership styles that are involved in running those paths. And if you've got a team of people who are clamoring for transformation and you're injecting an optimization, they're going to fight you every step of the way. and vice versa. If they're clamoring for optimization, can we just have some stability? Why do we have to keep changing things? And we're injecting yet another transformation, yet another disruption in the name of strategy. Well, you can see where things go sideways. So we've got to be really clear about what exactly we're doing and get every leader engaged in understanding this is the scope. Disruption is good or disruption is not good. And this is how we as a team want to collaborate. And then you want to look for that as you go through the execution so that people who start fighting it or losing sight of that, you get that feedback because you might have to make a decision to change back to more stabilization while you're changing, or you might have to generate some disruption and let people know it's okay. We'll get through this because their inner voice is screaming for stability, which then opens the door to how you prioritize. And it must be, I mean, incredibly concrete, incredibly prioritized, super, super clear. And it's got to be a short list. And when I worked with a company once that had 7 strategic things, I was like, oh my gosh, there's just no way. 7. I love the magic number 3. The most I've ever seen work effectively is 5. And to that point, there's a methodology. We're not going to go deep into it now, but there's an algorithm out there called 5, 6, 7 thinking. And it basically, Jim Collins' flywheel effect of how you get the momentum turning and getting better. You take your greatest impact, long list of all the things you can do to make this strategy execute, all the things you can do. Evaluate every single idea against which one gives you the greatest impact. And go low, medium, high. You don't have to be super complex. Low, medium, high impact. Divide that by the amount of time to implement, the amount of cost it will take to implement, and the amount of disruption it will generate. Be very, very clear, and you'll find that that math will give you a short list of about 5% of everything that you do those things, you will get about 67%. That's the 5, 6, 7. 67% of the progress you need in 3 to 6 months. The opposite of that is 95, 33. 95% of the things we're trying to do are at best going to generate 33% of the impact we need, which is what we wind up solving or settling for often when we execute our strategies. We have these big lofty dreams, and then we cut them in half because we know we won't get them all in 1 year. This challenges that thinking. But let's say you have phenomenal prioritization. You still need goal and role alignment, because at the end of the day, everything looks great on paper until people get involved. And my favorite model is GRPI, GRPI, goal and role clarity. The G and the R drive 96% of poor teaming. When we have a problem interpersonally, stop, don't fix that. Just say, are the processes working the way they're supposed to? Because if they're not, no wonder people are unhappy. But before we go fix the process, which often gets, we tell everybody, go do what we're told to do. Stop. Are the roles clear? Are the handoffs working the way? Are people clear on not only what their job is, but what other people's jobs are? Because if they're not, no wonder the processes are breaking down. Because if we have people doing, redoing, or even undoing other people's jobs, there is no process for that. But before we go fix that, make sure goals are super clear. Do we all have the same definition of success? And when I say definition of success, as it's listed here, I'm talking outcome metrics and requirements. And people talk about SMART goals and all this other stuff. I just moved away from it in my practice because outcomes, metrics, and requirements covers the same ideas, and it's much more concrete for people to wrap their heads around. Plus, not everybody even has the same definition of what SMART stands for. So the definition of success on that short list must then be attached to decision-making and veto authority. Who's making which decisions, and very importantly, who has veto authority? Because if sales and marketing have made an agreement and then finance comes in, or IT or another group and vetoes that decision, you want to talk about unraveling lack of clarity, lack of empowerment, lack of engagement, lack of accountability. All of that stuff starts to roll back in. I know it's been really quick, but we wanted to have more time for Q&A. And I know this will be recorded so people can watch it later if they need to and share it with the teammate. If you want me to contact you directly and explain some of this a little bit further, my email is right there on the bottom left, Tim@Kupu Solutions. And I would also be delighted if you chose to follow me on LinkedIn or Instagram, I should say. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. That was phenomenal. Really eye-opening. I love that reset on what the definition of strategy is. And I think you're right. Everyone is under the impression that it's a plan. But I love how it's been upended by actually it's a pattern of decisions and it's all around effective decision making. So I hope that was really interesting and thought-provoking for people. Tim, let me ask you a couple of questions whilst others are thinking about theirs. You talked about where to start in the model, in the wheel, and you did say clarity is really important, but do I have to start at clarity and work my way through? Couldn't I just go to accountability, for example? And you touched on that briefly. Maybe you could expand.
So it is very intentional, and I'm not going to get into all the psychology behind this, but you actually have building blocks that are happening in the brain that as you move through that, if you don't at least touch those building blocks, you won't be able to build on top of them. So the example I use is like building a building. If I'm going to build a 4 or 5 story building, I've got to make sure the foundation is dry and solid before I start working on the first and second floor. And I really need to get past a significant part of the first floor, at least structurally, before I start working on the floor number 2. So I always go through and double check the clarity before we move in. And it's amazing how often when I double check the clarity, it's not as tight as people thought it was. They look at the concrete, I can walk on it, it seems dry, but when you actually test it, it's not, it needs another week to dry and cure. Same idea. The clarity is not as clean as people think. And if I try to go push accountability without really clear scope, prioritization, goals, and roles, the accountability becomes subjective. And once it becomes subjective, well, bad things happen.
Yeah. Helen, question from you?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Catherine. Tim, really interesting discussion. Thank you. We're going through at AdLib a transformation. We're retooling lots of parts of the business to accelerate growth, lots of new people. We're reviewing our business model, how we execute across the sales cycle. We're learning. Could you sort of talk about this framework in that context? How do we kind of learn fast and fail fast?
That's great. There's just a couple of things I'm going to throw out here. First and foremost is it sounds like a flat out disruption. Everybody knows, everybody agrees it's a disruption. Is that correct? Everybody's understanding things are going to be crazy for a while, but that's accepted?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let's talk about prioritization. You talked about a lot of things. Is that a short list or a long list?
Well, so we're continuing to prioritize, but I think, my mantra is, focus is the focus. So do less rather than more. And so we're trying to learn and sort of adjust as we go, and be really good at fewer things and ensure that, everyone is rowing in the right direction. And I think it's hard. There are sort of so many different pieces that need to come together. And so, how do you sort of do this in a way that, frankly, people don't become breathless? They don't get whiplash because, we are iterating and it's not easy.
No. So my question would be, can you articulate 3 things that are the top priorities for this transformation and everything else is tertiary?
Yes, I think we can. I think the question then is, could else, right?
Yeah. So the what happens is people take the 3 and then they add 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 as it goes through the organization. And so you want to make sure things are rigorously attached to the top 3 things. And we can do a lot as long as it's under those 3. And if it steps outside of that, that's one quick check. The other thing is this 5, 6, 7 concept. A lot of times we go for the biggest rocks first. When you're dealing with something as complex, and you've even used the term wicked, where you've got complexity competing with itself, that even introducing a solution might create more disruption. You've got to make sure you're clear that we're doing things, the low-hanging fruit first and sequencing that execution, and then the goals and the roles line up against that sequence. The other thing I would throw in is the empowerment piece of this. You've got 4 things that I consistently tack on. Do we have enough people? Do we have enough time? Do we have enough energy? And do we have enough resources? So the people thing, obviously, do we have enough people? I had one company I worked with where massive transformation, they hadn't even hired whole groups of teams to go execute, but all the senior leaders for the regions were given numbers before they had even hired people to fill those things. That was a disempowering moment for every one of those leaders. Time, you get energy. This is the part where I think you're probably talking most, is how do you keep people from becoming fatigued How do you keep people from becoming confused or disoriented as all this stuff is moving around them? But that goes back to the amount of clarity you have in prioritization, because they can self-select and let certain things fly by otherwise. And the last is resources, and that's usually just budget, equipment, and space. And then I go back into your tech. And if you're introducing tech while you're also changing process, that's going to be a big problem, because most people, average human, can only handle one. I can either learn new tech that takes a process I already know, or I can change the process using the tech I have, and then I can learn the new tech. But if you try to do both at the same time, you're going to break down the empowerment piece, and then you're going to watch disengagement unravel or appear. Make sense?
That's super helpful. I think there's a balance that's needed, right?
Yeah.
To ensure
Yeah.
keep things moving without overwhelming the organization, and folks are focused on what's most important and of highest value. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Thanks, Helen. Couple of comments just on the chat here, Tim. So Roland says, like your definition of strategy and like Helen's point about doing less, someone once told me strategy is being clear about the decisions about what you will not do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so well said. Well, thank you, Roland. That's awesome. Totally.
And then he also said, I like the wheel too, simpler than Kotter's steps for leading change.
Yeah. I'm building on the shoulders of giants. So I'm a huge fan of Cotter, but this just simplifies it. I'm a simple guy. Let's be honest. I'm an island boy from the islands, and what can I say? We just no need make them too complex, as we say over here. Yeah.
Yes, we do have a tendency in life to make everything overly complicated. What if I hit a wall and I can't continue through the model?
Great question. Okay, so first and foremost, let's be clear. This is an idealistic model. Now, have I seen it work all the way around? I have, but not often. There's usually a breakdown when you get to accountability. You can get engagement going if you can get empowerment. Empowerment's usually, well, so let me break it down. You'll have a wall at clarity if you can't get leaders to align. And this goes back to, if your leadership is bad, you're stuck. But usually leaders want the clarity. They will all work there. The empowerment is where you hit the second one. You want to do it, but you're cash poor, you're technology
efficient.
limited. You are, I've got one customer, they're using systems that honestly that were technology from the 1990s, and here we're 2023, and they're trying to make things work, and it's just throwing all things. So until they upgrade the technology system, you really can't go any further on empowerment, and then you can't go into accountability at all. So then the engagement piece is usually a case of getting rid of the demotivation that's getting in the way. And again, that goes back to leadership making those decisions. Accountability is where it gets tough, because accountability is not injecting consequence for decisions. It's injecting trust without consequence. And that is a form of courage that many people are afraid of, especially
people being leaders, executives,
everybody, but especially senior leaders, because they've worked so hard to get to that level. They don't want to do anything that will risk them leaving that role.
Is there a fear that if they inject trust, they're relinquishing control?
Probably. Now we're into what triggers leadership. And so this is a whole part of this, a big part of my executive coaching.
Okay, so that leads me to my next question.
Yeah.
What if leadership is the problem?
So the quick answer is hire me to coach them. I'll give you an understanding of what's going on and what I do when I do coach. First and foremost, we've got to find out what triggers them getting into that state, because there's a part of our brains that's wonderful, it's creative, and we all have this prefrontal cortex. That's where our personality is, and we make great decisions and all that. But as soon as we inject fear, we go into survival mode, and we're back in our amygdala and the limbic part of our brain, and we're making decisions that we can articulate great logic for, but that's still fear-based, and it turns toxic. So the three most common causes is the fear of failing, the fear of rejection, and the fear of risk or the unknown. And they're anchored or tied directly to an addiction to success, an addiction to significance, and an addiction to control. And when leaders hit any one of those buttons, they go from here to here, and you've got three of them in the room all doing it. You can imagine what happens to the dialogue around what we're going to execute and what we're going to make as a decision.
So what you're saying is if leadership is the problem, we have to fix the leaders.
Yes, it's like, change people or change people.
Got it. We have a question in the chat. Do you see executive teams end up in this group think motion?
Yeah, 100%.
Hey,
So-
I was just going to say, if I'm using your decision-making framework, like maybe there's a way just to guide me through how to avoid, because I see that a lot. Ultimately, even with new teams, they end up in this group think. And I'm super curious on with what you covered today, how can that help me kind of break the cycle?
Yeah, so I would go back to that what I just shared about what's triggering what part of their brain they're using to go through that cycle. So if they're fear-based decision making, often I'll see, and I've got a client, we're working through this right now with their leadership team. They're afraid of conflict. They're afraid of offending each other. They're afraid of saying too much, and they'll go out and leave the room and they have their own side conversations, sidebars. But from them having really transparent and respectful conversation is not common for them to do, and they can't work through things because they're afraid of failing, they're afraid of rejection, or they're afraid of risk and the unknown. And so we've got to navigate that first, and that requires getting neutral, because once you're neutral, then you can be really honest. And now you can say, are we clear? Are we empowering? Are we engaging our people? Are we holding people accountable? What's the culture that we're directing and leading? Because we're the stewards of this whole thing. But if they can't get there in their brain, all decision-making is going to be hijacked.
Thanks, Kunal, for your question. All right. So, Tim, I have another question for you, which is like going all the way back potentially to the very beginning of this whole dialogue. And that is, what if my problem is the strategy?
If the problem is a strategy, that's why this model is designed to help you make it. You can identify where the gaps are when it breaks down. And if it's not working, your feedback goes back to the plan. Because remember, if we're clear and we're empowering by those 2 points already, we should be able to identify it's not working. You just can't force people through a bad strategy, because you'll lose the engagement. And by the time you get to engagement, forget trying to force accountability. What often happens is strategy is not working. So some senior leader or senior leaders push the button on what they call accountability. And what really it is just pressure. We're just going to put pressure on everybody. We're going to force them to do what we told them to do. And we're going to make them do it. It's not going to work. It's just not. We've all been there. I mean, we all have our own stories of being forced to change in a way that we're going, this just isn't making sense. And the whole organization feels that. So now you're into those tough moments. Do you endure the storm and do what you can with your team to protect them so that they're doing what they need to do? In marketing, I've seen people just do different initiatives that were complementary to the strategy because they knew that would at least support it, but it would move in the direction it needed to go. And then the worst case scenario, I've seen people just leave. They go, this is bad. I'm out. I'm out. And there's a lot of that happening right now. The great resignation and everything else. A lot of people are like, I'm out. And it's not just strategy for the business. It's also, I'm out because I'm not being paid enough. I'm being forced to do things and without the resource, and all the wheel comes to life. And the psychology of it takes over. It has way more to do with who we are as humans than what we have on our Excel spreadsheets.
Oh, wow. I completely agree with you. And I'm sure everyone on this call would too. But the reality is, businesses today are operating on the spreadsheets, and it's tough. It's tough. So I wish it could be as simple as just switching to being people-oriented versus spreadsheets. But, we are where we are, and spreadsheets is a fundamental way people are operating, and it's hard to break that habit.
Well, and the key is
fear,
here,
right?
It's important to have plans and spreadsheets and reporting and metrics. That's still important. But that's being tactical.
Yeah. Okay.
And we want to be strategic. And the strategic mindset of leaders is to create an environment where great decisions are being made. And then those things have value. But when those things hijack the process and everything's about updating the plan and meetings about the plan and governance about the plan and everything, it's like we're over-rotated to project management as a discipline and not strategic execution as a discipline.
Yeah, I think that's a true point. I'm sure others could agree. My last question to you is, Tim, is the problem revenue or is it something else?
That's a tough one to answer, right? So sometimes it is. Sometimes you need the revenue. You've got this great idea. We're operations there. We just need to expand our footprint. We've not gone broader. We've not opened the door to markets where we didn't go before. We were let fear hold us back. But now with that revenue issue, now you're back into the problem is what's holding you back from generating that revenue. And it could be a whole host of things from your operational excellence to your leadership to et cetera. But this is why the psychology of it is so hard, because most of us aren't taught these things growing up. Maybe trial and error. We all have our scars and our stripes that we've earned over time, but no one's really teaching us how to get neutral when stress is happening and how to navigate through it and how to identify the core problem, and using things like these as a framework for execution. It's usually like, let's look at the dashboard and it's red or yellow or green. And if it's red, freak out. What do we do? How do we fix it? Put Band-Aids on it. And to slow that down and to allow the organization to be able to not only make the right decision, but most importantly, learn from failure. It's okay to fail. A good friend of ours, Catherine Martin Lewis, says, failure is executing. If you're not failing, you're probably not doing anything that significant. You've got to embed that into how you think and learn from it. Don't do it over and over again.
Yes, of course, but also fail in the direction that you want to go, right?
That's right. Fail forward, as John Maxwell once said.
Yeah. And I lied. I actually have one more question for you. In the context of this whole conversation, could we switch out the word revenue for growth, or is that a completely different dialogue?
I think it's all the same. I've used this on any, from healthcare to tech to manufacturing to finance, and it all fits. It all fits as execution of strategy, even nonprofits. And to be fair, I think there's a lot of good ideas that are out there, regardless of what you're trying to execute, but we're not tapping into how we live as human beings to get it done.
Amazing. Tim, if the folks want to learn more or get help with their strategies and their execution thereof, what's the best way for them to reach you?
The easiest way is to email me directly, tim@kupusolutions.com, and I can send you a meeting tool to schedule something and we can talk. There's no harm and no cost in talking.
Absolutely. I completely second that. And of course, if anyone is looking to reach out to Tim, by all means, ping me as well. I'd be happy to share Tim's contact details. Tim, you're also on LinkedIn, of course, and I think Instagram.
And then we have a podcast, How to Not Execute Your Strategy, if you want to look for that on your favorite platform.
Oh, yeah. Guys, you should listen to that. I've been listening to that. Lots to learn there.
Yeah, I interviewed 7 CEOs tell me about a time you failed. What'd you learn from it? And then 2 or 3 things that everybody in the organization needs to have as an attribute in order to be a culture of execution. Fascinating discussions.
Awesome. Tim, thank you so very much for your time. It's been absolutely amazing and enlightening. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to our next session.